some more revolutionary theory. Among the many outstanding revolutionary figures of the 20th century, one of the most remarkable was the Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh. In order to achieve the liberation of his country, the national liberation movement he led for nearly 40 years had to defeat not one but two of the world's major imperialistic powers, France and the United States, and withstand 5 years of Japanese occupation. Without a revolutionary party and leadership, Vietnam's victory have been unthinkable. Ho Chi Minh was the founding leader of the Indochinese Communist Party, later the Vietnam Workers' Party. Ho was a founding member of the French Communist Party. A decade later, the position of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party on supporting the right of the oppressed nations of self-determination was key in winning him over to communism. So it's important to know the Cuban Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Russian revolutions, because a lot of people use a lot of the, I think Trotsky and Lenin was like one of the most read people in one of the few years, Google or something, I don't know. But people want to know about these people, and that's, there's like Trotskyism and Leninism and Stalinism, right? And so essentially it's just whatever they believed, and it's how you define it too. So you need a theoretical framework if you actually want to have a good conversation. They called that the August Revolution, August 19th, 1945. The Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh began a revolution against French colonial rule in Vietnam. From August 19th onwards, demonstrations and uprising against French rule broke out in cities and towns throughout Vietnam. Given Japan had surrendered to the Allies at the end of World War II, the Japanese forces in Indochina stepped aside and allowed nationalist groups to take over public buildings in most of the major cities. While the Japanese allowed the national groups free run of the country, they kept former French officials imprisoned. At the time, the Viet Minh were provided with minor supplies by the United States to fight the Japanese. So we're going to fight the Vietnamese later on, but we were supplying supplies for them to fight the Japanese. So we've been involved in Vietnam for a long time, right? But they had their own revolution. They declared Vietnam an independent country, an independent state. So they modeled it just after the Declaration of Independence and the Revolution, the American Revolution, which could be a mistake. I mean, it's our revolution. It's what sort of unites us all into a common vision, the documents and the freedoms and anti-colonial British rule. But that's, I don't know if it really should, because black people, women, Native Americans, anybody that didn't have property that was under 21 years old was not part of the government. So it wasn't a revolution. It basically stopped a revolution, There could have been an integrationist revolution, a rainbow revolution, right? The Cuban Revolution. I'm going to at least get to the definitions of these before it cuts out. There's another 12 minutes gone. But the Cuban Revolution, or the Revolution on Cuba, was an armed revolt conducted by Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement and its allies against the government of Cuban President Fulgencio Batista. The revolution began in July 1953 and finally ousted Batista January 1st, 1959. So the revolution lasted for 6 years. Okay, so 6 years in Cuba. The revolution for Vietnam lasted for almost 40 years, but they had to fight two imperialist nations. 6 years for Cuba. America was about 5 to 9 years, depending on the fighting itself was 5 years. The negotiations took a little bit longer. The Haitian Revolution, it lasted from 1791 to 1804, so they went on for 13 years. Okay, the Haitian Revolution just went on and on. It became an independent country in January 1st, 1804. So you got the French Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. Okay, so the Cuban Revolution was conducted by Fidel Castro, his 26th of July movement. Che Guevara's right here next to him while this is happening. The movement organization later reformed along communist lines, becoming the Communist Party in October 1965. The Communist Party, now headed by Castro's brother Raul, continues to govern Cuba today. So he had a revolution, but then he became the dictator, right? The dictator of the proletariat. They just stay in power forever and ever. So Cuba could use a revolution, or a turnover of power, a new leadership or a new constitution. It's been 50-something years. They need a revolution, okay? The Communist Party now had, let's see, the Cuban Revolution had great domestic and international repercussions. In particular, it reshaped Cuba's relation with the United States, which continues an embargo against Cuba as of 2014. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, Castro's government began a program of nationalization and political consolidation, transformed Cuba's economy and civil society. The revolution also heralded an era of Cuban intervention into foreign military conflicts, including the Angolan Civil War and the Nicaraguan Revolution. So that's amazing. Cuba's a tiny country, right? And supposedly the economic system is supposed to be bad, but they're able to supply troops to foreign interventions. And so I think they were there for South Africa's apartheid. And then you had the Angolan Civil War and the Nicaraguan Revolution, which is amazing. The embargo against Cuba is a commercial, economic, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba by the United States. It began on October 19, 1960, almost 2 years after the Batista regime was deposed by the Cuban Revolution. So 1960 is when it's been on there. It's been on there for 54 years. We've had a 54-year embargo. And so that's why a Cuban cigar is like, you know, it's only tobacco, but it's like well crafted and it's a big fat cigar, right? So that's why there's a... It's expensive since it's illegal. U.S. placed an embargo on exports to Cuba except for food and medicine on February 7th, 1962, extended to include almost all imports. So yeah, we're a bunch of jerks. Background and causes of the Cuban Revolution. Fulgencio Batista served as the elected president of Cuba from 1940 to 44. Became president for the second time in March 1952 after seizing power in a military coup and canceling the 1952 election. So he was a dictator, right? Military coup. Although Batista had been a relative progressive during his first term in the 1950s, he proved far more dictatorial and indifferent to popular concerns. While Cuba remained plagued by high employment and limited water infrastructure, Batista antagonized the population by forming lucrative links to organized crime and allowing American companies to dominate the Cuban economy. During his first term as president, Batista had been supported by the Communist Party of Cuba, but during the second term he became strongly anti-communist, gaining him political support, military aid from the U.S. Batista developed powerful security infrastructure to silence political opponents, leading John F. Kennedy to describe the Cuban government as a complete police state in 1960. In the months following the March 1952 coup, Fidel Castro, then a young lawyer and activist, petitioned for the overthrow of Batista, whom he accused of corruption and tyranny. However, Castro's constitutional arguments were rejected by the Cuban courts. After deciding that the Cuban state cannot be overthrown through legal means, Castro resolved to launch an armed revolution. To this end, he and his brother Raul founded a paramilitary organization known as the Movement, stockpiling weapons, recruiting around 1,200 followers from Havana's disgruntled working class by the end of 1952. So, yeah. Lots of stuff happens. Ernesto, let's see, in June 1955, Fidel met the Argentine revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara, who joined his cause. The revolutionaries named themselves the 26th of July movement in reference to the date of their attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953. Guerrilla warfare. Here's Kennedy. A quote by Kennedy. I believe that there's no country in the world, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba. In part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime, I approved the proclamation which Fidel Castro made in the Sierra Maestra when he justifiably called for justice and especially yearned to rid Cuba of corruption. I will even go farther. To some extent, it is as though Batista was the incarnation of a number of sins on the part of the U.S. Now we shall have to pay for those sins. In the matter of the Batista regime, I am in agreement with the first Cuban revolutionaries. That is perfectly clear. So he's in agreement with the first revolutionaries. So Batista was a corrupt person and was not good. So JFK was in, and actually the Bay of Pigs, Shea says, thank God for the Bay of Pigs, right? If it wasn't for the Bay of Pigs, then we might not have won our revolution. The Bay of Pigs get the got the Cuban people on their side. The Bay of Pigs is an inlet in the Gulf of Cazones located on the southern coast of Cuba. I wish the Bay of Pigs would have gone to the Bay of Pigs I was talking about. Invasion. Because Kennedy apologized and we was all glad that he apologized, right? It's noted in Latin America as Invasion del Bajine de Coquinas, or Invasion de Playa Grion, or Batilla de Grion. So the invasion of the Bay of Pigs is a failed military invasion of Cuba undertaken by the CIA-sponsored paramilitary group Brigade 2506 on April 17, 1961. A counter-revolutionary military trained and funded by the U.S. government's CIA Brigade 2506 fronted the armed wing of the Democratic Revolutionary Front and intended to overthrow the revolutionary left-wing government of Fidel Castro. Launched from Guatemala, the invading force was defeated within 3 days by the Cuban armed forces under direct command of Prime Minister Fidel Castro. The Cuban Revolution of 1949 to 1959, so it lasted for 10 years, had seen President Fulgencio Batista, a right-wing ally of the U.S., ousted. He was replaced by a new left-wing administration dominated by Fidel Castro, who had severed the country's formerly strong links with the U.S. by expropriating their economic assets and developing links with the Soviet Union, with whom the U.S. was embroiled in the Cold War. The U.S. government of President Dwight D. Eisenhower is concerned at the direction which Castro's government was taken. In March 1960, Eisenhower allocated $13.1 million to the CIA in order to plan Castro's overthrow. The CIA proceeded to organize the operation with the aid of various Cuban counter-revolutionary forces trained in Brigade 2506 in Mexico. Following his election in 1960, President John F. Kennedy was informed of the invasion plan and gave his consent. Over 1,400 paramilitaries divided into 5 infantry battalions. So it eventually led to the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Invasion was a major embarrassment for U.S. foreign policy. John F. Kennedy ordered a number of internal investigations across much of Latin America. It was celebrated as evidence of the fallibility of U.S. imperialism. 26th of July movement, a vanguard revolutionary organization planned and led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara in the 1959 overthrow of the Fulgencio Batista dictatorship in Cuba. The movement fought the Batista regime on both rural and urban fronts. 26th of July movement's name originated from the failed attacks on the Moncada barracks, an army facility in the city of Santiago de Cuba. 26th July 1953, the movement was reorganized in Mexico in 1955 by a group of 82 exiled revolutionaries, including Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Camila Cienfuegos, Huber Matos, Juan Amiada Bosque, and the Argentina Ernesto Che Guevara. The task was to form a disciplined guerrilla force to overthrow Batista. So they did this in Mexico, right? So they're plotting in Mexico in the 1950s. Mexico just had their revolution in the 1910s or 1920s. The French Revolution, there's a lot to it, so I will actually wait for that next video to get into that. That was the Cuban Revolution, so we got to see what happened with it was all Fidel Castro. It was his entire thing, right? Raul, Fidel, and Che. And a lot of these initial revolutionaries stay in power till the very end. Even Trotsky and them, like, they ruled for about 10 to 20 years before Trotsky was put on the run and murdered with an ice pick in Mexico. So, and then Stalin stayed in power for about 50 or so years. Even that one guy in China, who's that Chinese guy, that communist, whatever his name was, he was passing out little communist red books and the Great Leap Forward. But he had, I don't know what I was trying to say. He was a jerk. He was a bad guy. Yeah. So, the Haitian Revolution. Who was that guy in China? I don't know. Have to pull that up. So the Haitian Revolution, a revolting of slaves in France, 1791 to 1804. So just after the American Revolution, you got the Haitian Revolution. And did America support the revolutionaries? Did we support the oppressed people as we, did we live up to the ideas of our own revolution with France's revolution and Haiti's revolution? The answer is No, no, we did not, at all, not even close, right? So the Russian Revolution had lots of implication. In fact, they had thought that they was going to spread communism all over the place because they saw what happened in the 1848 revolutions, right? Just the idea of working people having power started revolutions all across Europe. So what if someone actually did it? And they did it, right? But not everybody followed them the way they wanted people to follow them.